It was overcast, morning in downtown Los Angeles, and the streets were already bustling. People hustled to work, the scent of food carts wafted through the air, and constant honking of car horns created a soundtrack that uniquely belonged to LA. Meanwhile, down the sidewalk trotted a scrawny little street dog. He moved with confidence, his nose sniffing the air, his eyes darting here and there, as if he had somewhere very important to be. Unbeknownst to most of the busy pedestrians, two men were closely watching the dog from a dark SUV parked across the street. Plainly dressed, there was nothing to be said about the seriousness of their demeanor. Agent Davis, the older of the two, adjusted his sunglasses and didn't take his eyes off the dog. Beside him, Agent Carter tapped his fingers impatiently on the dashboard, his brow furrowed. "Are you sure about this, Davis?" Carter asked, a hint of skepticism in his voice. "We're really supposed to be following a stray dog? This just feels—" "I don't know, ridiculous." Davis shot him a sideways glance, his expression one of annoyance. "Orders are orders, Carter. The tip we got said this dog could lead us somewhere important. Maybe even to the warehouse where those missing shipments are being stored." Carter snorted, shaking his head. "Right. A street dog is going to lead us to some big criminal operation. That's a bad movie plot." Davis didn't say a word. He merely started the car and continued to stare at the dog as it trotted down the sidewalk, his tail bobbing happily. "Just keep your eyes on him. We can't afford to lose this lead." With a resigned sigh, Carter leaned back in his seat, his eyes tracking the dog as it trotted along, dodging through the crowd. The agents stayed back, their SUV cruising slowly down the street to keep pace with the little creature. The dog seemed to know where he was going, his steps purposeful, his ears perked as he navigated through the city. After several minutes of following the dog, Carter exhaled loudly. "This is insane. We've gone by 2 taco stands, a park, and now we're going into the industrial area. Are we seriously supposed to believe this dog is on to something?" Davis did not pay any attention to his complaints. The dog turned down a narrow alleyway, and Davis followed him with speed, crunching gravel beneath the tires as he entered the alley. Carter shifted in his seat, eyes narrowing as they watched the dog dart through the alley, his small frame disappearing behind a stack of old crates. "I swear, if this dog leads us to a dead end, and putting in for a transfer," Carter muttered, shaking his head. But Davis wasn't listening. He drew the SUV to a stop at the end of the alley, his eyes narrowing as he watched the dog disappear through a gap in a rusty chain-link fence. The agents exchanged a glance, and Davis nodded towards the fence. "Come on. Let's go see where he's leading us." Carter let out a sigh and opened his door, stepping out of the SUV. "Can't believe him doing this," he grumbled, following Davis toward the fence. They slipped through the gap, their shoes crunched over broken glass and debris into an overgrown lot. Up ahead, the dog was sniffing around a pile of discarded wooden pallets, his tail wagging. "What do you think he's looking for?" asked Carter, his voice hushed. Davis didn't respond. Instead, he watched in fascination as the dog abruptly came to attention, his ears twitching. He yelped once and was off and running, toward a large, dilapidated building at the far end of the lot. Davis and Carter exchanged another look, wordless, and began following after, eyes scanning left and right, alert for anything that seemed out of place. The building looked like it hadn't been used in years, its windows shattered, the paint peeling from the walls, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. The dog ran up to the door, pawing at it and letting out another bark. Davis approached cautiously, his hand resting on the gun holstered at his side. "All right, let's see what you found," he muttered, the creaking door groaning open. The inside of the building was dark, thick with the scent of dust and mildew. Davis pulled out his flashlight, the beams slicing through the darkness as he stepped inside, Carter right behind him. The dog patted them through the building, his paws silent on the concrete floor. Past old machinery, stacks of rusted metal, and piles of debris they went. The skepticism was really starting to wane inside Carter, who found his mind replacing it with an overwhelming feeling of unease. Something in the way the dog moved, so sure, so confident, made him think that just maybe they were onto something. "You hear that?" Davis whispered, his flashlight beam pausing on a door at the far end of the room. From the other side, faint voices could be heard, and Davis motioned to Carter as they moved closer to the door. The dog barked again, his tail wagging, as he sat in front of the door as if to say, "This is it." He took a deep breath, his hand resting on the knob. He looked over at Carter, who nodded. His hand rested on his weapon. In one swift motion, Davis turned the door open, his beam of light piercing into the other room. What they saw froze the agents in their spots. The room was packed with crates, dozens, all with the same logo they had been seeking. And standing in the middle of the room, amidst those crates and just as surprised as the agents, were three men with shocked and confused expressions. "FBI. Hands where we can see them," Davis yelled, his voice bouncing off the walls. The men hesitated for a second, then raised their hands pale-faced. Carter took another step forward, his eyes wide with incredulity. "I don't believe it," he muttered under his breath. "The dog actually led us here." In a blink of an eye, the three men were in handcuffs, their heads hung in defeat as they were led out of the building. Davis watched them leave, then turned to the dog that sat proudly in the middle of the room, his tail wagging, knowing just what he did. Carter laughed, and shook his head. "You know, Davis, I take back everything I said. This dog might just be the best agent we've got." Davis smiled and reached down to give the dog a pat on the head. "Good job, buddy. Looks like we owe you one." The dog yelped in delight, his tail wagging even harder as he looked up at the agents. Davis and Carter exchanged a glance. A shared sense of disbelief and admiration passed between them. They had set out to follow a lead that seemed ridiculous, but in the end, the scrappy street dog had led them straight to the heart of the operation. As they walked back to their SUV, the dog trotting beside them, Carter couldn't help but grin. "So, what do we call him? Agent Bark?" Davis chuckled, shaking his head. "I think he's earned something a little more dignified than that. How about Scout?" Carter nodded, giving the dog a smile. "Scout it is." And with that, the three of them, two seasoned FBI agents and one very unlikely hero, headed back into the city, the sun beginning to break through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the streets. It wasn't the kind of day they had expected, but it was one they would never forget. And for Scout, it was another day of doing what he did best, being in the right place at the right time, and leading the way. They were back at the FBI field office the following day, desks covered with mounds of paperwork. It was always this way after a successful operation, excitement and adrenaline of the buzz prior to the mundane reality of filling out reports and documenting every single detail. Davis leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as he stared at his computer screen. "You know, I think I'd rather chase that dog around the city again than finish this paperwork," Carter said, exhaling as he flipped through a stack of documents. He glanced over at Scout, who was contentedly lying on a blanket that had been set up in the corner of the office. The little street dog seemed to have become an overnight mascot, and everyone in the office simply adored him. Davis smiled, turning towards Scout. "Yeah, at least that was exciting," he said. "But man, we did great. Recovered those shipments, arrested 3 guys, all because of that furry little fellow over there." Carter chuckled. "Who would have thought? A street dog leading us to a big bust. If I hadn't seen it myself, I wouldn't have believed it." The door to their office opened at that moment, and in came Special Agent in Charge Reynolds, his expression as scowly as usual. He looked from Davis across to Carter, then down at Scout, who had lifted his head and let out a friendly bark. "Good job, both of you," Reynolds said, his voice gruff. "But don't get too comfortable. We have a situation." He tossed a file onto Davis' desk, and both agents leaned forward, their eyes narrowing as they read the contents. "Another warehouse?" Davis asked, glancing up at Reynolds. Reynolds nodded. "Intelligence suggests there's a second location, even bigger than the one you found yesterday. We need you two to check it out." Carter groaned, sagging back in his chair. "You mean more paperwork?" Reynolds gave him a withering look. "Only if you make it back. Let's hope this one goes as smoothly as the last. And take the dog with you. He seems to have a nose for this kind of thing. Carter raised an eyebrow, looking over at Scout. You want us to take Scout? Are you serious? Reynolds shrugged. The dog led you to the first warehouse. Maybe he can do it again. With that, he turned and left the room, leaving Davis and Carter staring at each other in disbelief. Davis finally broke the silence, a small smile tugging at his lips. Well, you heard the boss. Looks like Scout's coming along. Carter shook his head, gaining his feet and snatching up his jacket. This is getting more ridiculous by the minute. Next thing you know, they'll be giving him a badge. He crossed to Scout, who received a pat on the head. All right, Scout. Ready for round 2? Scout barked loudly, his tail wagging furiously as he jumped to his feet, ready to be off on their next adventure. Davis chuckled, reaching for his jacket and heading for the door. Let's go, partner, he said, gesturing for Scout to follow. The three headed out of the office, garnering light-hearted glances from their coworkers as they walked through the bullpen. Scout trotted proudly beside Davis, ears perked, eyes bright with excitement. He couldn't help but smile as they reached the parking lot and climbed into their SUV, Scout hopping into his back seat. All right, Scout, Carter said, turning back to the dog. Let's see if you got any more magic in that nose of yours. Davis turned the key, and they pulled out of the parking lot, heading to the industrial area on the city's outskirts. The file had given them a rough location, but it was still a long shot. There were dozens of abandoned warehouses in that area, and finding the right one would be like looking for a needle in a haystack. They drove a while in complete silence, the tension in the car palpable. Carter kept looking back at Scout, who seemed entirely nonplussed by the gravity of events unfolding. He was sitting up, his nose twitching as he snuffled the air, his eyes scanning the passing landscape. The industrial area reached them after almost an hour's drive. The scenery changed from busy city streets to lots and dilapidated buildings. Davis pulled the SUV to a stop, turning to Carter. All right, let's see if our friend can work his magic again. Opening the back door, Carter let Scout jump out to sniff the ground as he started to trot ahead, his nose to the pavement. Davis and Carter exchanged glances, following him as their eyes roamed over the area for signs of activity. Scout led them down a narrow street, sure of himself, his tail in a wag as he trotted past a row of dilapidated buildings. Carter shook his head, a smile pulling at his lips. You know, I still can't believe we're doing this. Following a dog through an industrial wasteland, hoping hell lead us to a bunch of criminals. Davis shrugged, never taking his eyes off Scout. Stranger things have happened, Carter. Besides, he hasn't let us down yet. They continued to follow Scout, the little dog leading them deeper into the industrial area. The air was thick with the smell of oil and rust, and the only sounds were the distant hum of machinery and the crunch of gravel beneath their feet. Scout suddenly froze, his ears perked up as he looked toward a large, dilapidated warehouse at the end of the street. He let out a low growl, his fur standing on end. Davis and Carter exchanged a glance, their faces turning serious. Looks like Scout's found something, Davis said, his voice barely above a whisper. Carter nodded, his hand falling to the gun at his side. Let's check it out. They approached the warehouse cautiously, Scout leading the way, his growl growing loud as they neared the building. The windows were boarded up, and the door was reinforced with heavy metal bars. Davis motioned for Carter to move to the side, and reaching out tried the door handle. It was locked, but from inside, they could hear muffled voices. Definitely something going on in there, Carter muttered, his eyes narrowing. Davis nodded, stepping back and pulling out his radio. This is Agent Davis. We've located a potential target at the industrial area. Requesting backup at our location. He gave the coordinates, then glanced at Carter. Well, wait for backup before making a move. Carter nodded, his eyes still on the warehouse. You hear that, Scout? You did it again, buddy, he said, giving the dog a tap on the head. Scout's growl turned into a soft bark, his tail wagging with understanding of the praise. They waited in silence, the tension mounting as they kept their eyes on the warehouse. Minutes felt like hours, and Carter could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced at Davis, who was focused, his jaw set, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. Finally, the silence was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles. Carter let out a sigh of relief as he saw the FBI backup arriving. A dozen agents, armed and ready, flowed from the vehicles, deploying in a cordon around the warehouse. Special Agent Reynolds approached Davis and Carter, his face grim. "What's the situation?" Reynolds asked, his eyes going to the warehouse. Davis nodded towards the building. "We've got multiple voices inside. Doors locked, windows boarded up. Scout led us here, and he's been growling since we got close." Reynolds glanced at Scout, then back at Davis. "All right. Let's move in." Davis nodded to the other agents, who then moved in to surround the warehouse. Carter's heart pounded in his chest as he found his position beside the door, his weapon drawn. A signal from Davis and the door burst with a loud crash. Agents streamed into the building, their flashlights cutting through the dark. The scene inside was one of chaos. Men scrambling to hide, overturned crates, shouts that echoed off the walls. Davis and Carter moved swiftly, their guns pointed at the suspects, their orders yelled. In a few moments, all the chaos died down. The suspects were in handcuffs, their heads hung down in defeat. Reynolds stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room, then turned to Davis and Carter, a rare smile tugging at his lips. "Good work, agents. Looks like you found the motherlode." Carter let out a breath he hadn't realized had been holding, a grin spreading across his face. "All thanks to Scout," he said, glancing down at the little dog, who was sitting proudly by his side, his tail wagging. Reynolds nodded, giving Scout an encouraging look. "Looks like we've got ourselves a new agent," he said, his voice light. Davis squatted and started scratching behind Scout's ears. "What do you say, Scout? Want to join the team?" Scout barked, the brilliance of excitement in his eyes, and Carter couldn't help but burst into a laugh. "I think that's a yes." As the suspects were escorted out of the warehouse and agents started processing the scene, Davis, Carter, and Scout stood together, the feeling of accomplishment washing over them. They had followed a lead that seemed utterly absurd, trusted a dog that no one else would have given a second glance, and it led them to something big. And as they headed back in the direction of their SUV, Scout trotting happily beside them, Carter couldn't keep a smile off his face. "You know, Davis, I think Scout might just be the best partner we've ever had." Davis nodded, his expression softening as he looked down at the dog. "Yeah, Carter. I think you're right." With the sun setting on the horizon, casting a warm glow over the industrial landscape, the three of them climbed into the SUV, ready to head back to the city. It had been another unexpected day, full of twists and turns, but one thing was clear: Scout was no ordinary street dog. He was a hero, and he was just getting started. The succeeding days were absolutely unparalleled for Agent Davis and Agent Carter at the FBI field office, with words spreading like wildfire regarding the tale of Scout the street dog who became an unlikely hero through their department and several news outlets. People from all over the city had seen the footage of Scout leading the agents to the warehouse, and now the scrappy dog was a local celebrity. Scout had become the face of the FBI's recent success, and everyone wanted to know more about the little dog that seemed to have a knack for sniffing out trouble. Scout had even appeared on a morning news show locally, where he sat proudly next to Carter, his tail happily wagging as the anchor praised his bravery. Carter couldn't help but beam with pride as the anchor referred to Scout as a hero. Davis watched the segment from the office, shaking his head with a smile. "Who would have thought, huh?" he said to himself, amused by the turn of events. The atmosphere in the office was light, and for once, paperwork didn't seem as chore-like. Even Reynolds, normally as stern as they came, seemed to soften up, his lips quirking into a small smile whenever Scout wandered into his office. The little dog had a way of bringing warmth to the normally rigid environment that everyone seemed to appreciate. But as much as they enjoyed the newfound fame, Davis knew their work was far from over. They had uncovered 2 major warehouses connected with the smuggling ring, but intelligence suggested there were more out there. The operation was larger than they had initially thought, and they couldn't afford to let their guard down now. He was sitting at his desk flipping through a stack of reports one morning when his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen and noticed it was a message from their informant, a man they had been working with for months. The message was short, but his heart skipped a beat when he read, "Got a lead on another warehouse. Might be the big one. Coordinates attached." Davis leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. If this was the big one, it could mean the end of the smuggling operation that had plagued the city for so long. He looked over at Carter, who was tossing a ball for Scout to fetch across the office, and cleared his throat. "Carter, we've got something." Carter turned, catching the ball as Scout brought it back. "What is it?" he asked. In an instant, his face had gone from playful to serious. Davis held up his phone. "A lead on another warehouse. Our informant says it could be the main hub. We need to check it out." Carter's eyes widened, and he looked down at Scout, who seemed to sense the change in atmosphere. "You hear that, Scout? Looks like we've got another mission." Scout barked, his tail wagging as he trotted over to Davis, as if ready to lead the way once more. Davis smiled, grabbing his jacket and standing up. "Let's not waste any time. If this is the big one, we need to move fast." The three of them exited the office to a few raised eyebrows from fellow colleagues as they left. As they neared the SUV, Davis could feel a bud of tension growing in his chest. This was the lead they had been waiting for. If they could shut down the main hub, they could cripple the entire operation. The drive to the coordinates was long, taking them out of the city and into the outskirts, where old industrial complexes and warehouses dotted the landscape. The air thickened with tension as Carter kept looking back at Scout, who sat up and twitched his nose, his head pointing like he knew something important was ahead. "You think this is it, really?" Carter asked in a low tone as they turned down the dirt road that would lead them to a big, secluded warehouse. The building was huge and surrounded by high fences with security cameras mounted at their different points. It looked far more sophisticated than the previous locations they had raided. Davis nodded, narrowing his eyes as he surveyed the area. "It has to be. Look at the security. They wouldn't go to this much trouble unless they were hiding something big." He pulled the SUV to a stop a safe distance away, and they both got out. Scout jumped down from the back seat, his ears perked and his eyes focused on the warehouse. Davis pulled out his binoculars, scanning the perimeter. There were guards patrolling, their movements methodical, and several trucks were parked near the entrance, their back doors open as men unloaded crates. "Looks like we've got a lot of activity," Davis said, handing the binoculars to Carter. "We need to be smart about this." Carter nodded, his eyes narrowing as he watched the scene. "We're gonna need backup. No way we're getting in there alone." Davis pulled out his radio, contacting the field office. "This is Agent Davis. We've located a high-value target. Requesting immediate backup at the coordinates I'm sending now. Possible main hub of the smuggling ring." As they waited for backup, Davis and Carter hunched behind a cluster of bushes, their eyes on the warehouse. Scout was beside them, his ears twitching, his body tense. Davis reached over, giving the dog a reassuring pat. "You ready for this, Scout?" Scout looked up at him, his eyes bright with determination, and let out a soft bark. Carter chuckled. "I think he's more ready than we are." It wasn't long before the sound of approaching vehicles reached their ears, and Davis felt a wave of relief as he saw the convoy of FBI SUVs making their way down the dirt road. Special Agent Reynolds stepped out of one of the vehicles, his eyes scanning the area before landing on Davis and Carter. "What do we have?" Reynolds asked, his voice all business. Davis gestured towards the warehouse. "Guards patrolling, trucks unloading crates. It's heavily guarded. This has to be the main hub." Reynolds nodded, turning to the agents behind him. "All right, listen up. We're moving in. I want teams on every entrance. We do this clean and by the book. No one gets away." The agents moved into position, and Davis felt his heart pound as they prepared to breach the warehouse. He looked sideways at Carter, who nodded, his face set. Scout sat between them, his ears pricked, staring at the warehouse as if he knew just what was about to go down. With a signal from Reynolds, the agents moved in. The only sound was that of boots crunching on gravel in the stillness. Davis and Carter took up positions at the main entrance, Scout beside them, his body taut. The door was breached with a loud crash, and the agents poured into the warehouse, their flashlights cutting through the dim light. Inside, it was chaos, men shouting, crates being overturned, and the sound of footsteps clattering off concrete walls. Davis and Carter moved swiftly, their guns drawn, as they navigated through a maze of crates and machinery. Scout stayed close to their heels, his nose to the ground, leading them deeper into the warehouse. Rounding the corner brought them face to face with a group of men, wild-eyed in panic. FBI! Hands in the air! Davis shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. The men hesitated for one moment before dropping their weapons to go up in the air, hands waving in surrender. Carter moved forward, securing the suspects as Davis continued to clear the area. Scout suddenly perked up, his ears twitching as he darted towards a stack of crates, barking loudly. Davis followed, his flashlight beam revealing a hidden door behind the crates. He glanced at Carter, who had just finished cuffing the suspects. Over here! Scouts found something. Carter rushed over, his eyes widening as he saw the hidden door. Good job, Scout, he muttered, giving the dog a quick pat before turning his attention to the door. Davis tried the handle, and to his surprise, it opened easily, revealing a staircase leading down into the darkness. Looks like we've got a basement, Davis said, his voice low. He glanced at Carter, then at Scout. Let's see what's down there. They went down the stairs, the air growing cold as they descended. The basement was poorly lit. The walls were lined with shelves right up to the ceiling, stacked with crates and boxes. In the middle of the room stood a huge table, with maps and documents covering the top. Davis' eyes widened as he realized what they had found: a command center, the heart of the entire operation. This is it, Carter whispered, his eyes scanning the room. This is where they've been running everything. Davis nodded, his heart pounding as he moved towards the table, his eyes scanning the documents. There were shipping routes, contact lists, detailed plans for the smuggling operations. This was everything that they needed to bring down the entire network. Scout barked, his tail wagging, sniffing the room as his nose led him to a crate in the corner. Davis walked over, prying it open to reveal stacks of cash and bags filled with what looked like narcotics. He let out a low whistle. Jackpot, he muttered. Reynolds' voice came over the radio. Status? Davis picked up his radio, a smile tugging at his lips. We've got the command center. This is the hub. We've got documents, cash, narcotics, everything. There was a pause, then Reynolds' voice came back, a note of satisfaction in his tone. Good work. Secure everything. We're wrapping this up. As the agents moved to secure the basement, Davis looked down at Scout, who sat proudly by his side, his tail wagging. You did it, Scout, he said, his voice full of admiration. You really are the best partner we could ask for. Carter nodded, a grin spreading across his face. I think it's time we got you that badge, buddy. Scout barked, his eyes bright with excitement, and Davis couldn't help but laugh. It had been a long journey, full of unexpected twists and turns, but they had done it. They had brought down the smuggling ring, and it was all thanks to a scrappy little street dog with a nose for justice. As they made their way back up the stairs, documents and evidence secured, Davis couldn't help but feel a surge of pride in his chest. They had taken down a major operation, and they had done it together as a team. And Scout, the unlikely hero, had once more proved that sometimes, in fact, the most improbable partners could make all the difference. As the sun set outside, casting that golden glow over the warehouse, Davis, Carter, and Scout stepped out into the cool evening air, ready to head back to the city. They had much work ahead of them, reports to file, evidence to process, but for now, they could take a moment to appreciate what they had accomplished. And as they climbed into the SUV, Scout settling into the back seat with a contented sigh, Davis couldn't help but smile. Let's go home, Scout, he said, starting the engine. We've earned it. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity at the FBI field office. The major smuggling ring dismantled, Agents Davis and Carter and Scout found themselves in the middle of a storm: paperwork, debriefings, interviews. News of the success spread far and wide, and the little street dog that helped them had become something of a legend. Scout had earned not only a badge but also a permanent place in the field office, complete with his own little bed and a plaque that read, Special Agent Scout. It made Davis smile every time he saw that plaque, a reminder of the big journey they were on that was first given with what seemed to be the craziest lead any person would ever follow in his entire career: a street dog. But Scout proved himself time and again, and was now part of the team. The two men sat at their desks on into the afternoon, wading their way through the never-ending stacks of paperwork a case of that size generated. Scout lay sleeping in the back of the room on his dog bed, his eyes open partway, seeming to relish a well-earned nap. Carter stopped writing, turned his attention to the quiet figure on the dog bed and smiled at him. "You know, I think Scout's got it all figured out," Carter said, tipping his chair back. "He does the hard work, gets all the glory, and now he gets to nap while we do the paperwork." Davis chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, I'd say he's earned it. Besides, I don't think we could have done any of this without him. He's a better partner than most agents I've worked with." Carter nodded in agreement. No arguments here. A moment of silence passed before he said, "You know, it's kind of funny. I never thought I'd be sitting here, talking about a dog as one of the best partners I've ever had. But Scout's different. He's got a sense about him." Davis smiled, looking over at Scout, who opened one eye and let out a soft huff, as if acknowledging the praise. "Yeah, he does. And I think he's just getting started." Just then, the door to the office opened, and Special Agent Reynolds stepped inside, his expression unreadable as always. He looked from Davis to Carter, then down at Scout, who lifted his head and wagged his tail in greeting. "Got something for you too," Reynolds said, tossing a file onto Davis' desk. "It's not over yet. We've got intel on a splinter group, what's left of the smuggling ring that didn't go down with the main hub. They're trying to reorganize." Davis picked up the file, his eyes narrowing as he flipped through the pages. Carter leaned in, his brow furrowing. "You're saying there's more of them out there?" Reynolds nodded. "That's right. And we need to take them down before they can rebuild. You two did a great job last time, and I'm counting on you to finish what you started." Davis glanced at Carter, then down at Scout, who had stood up, his ears perked as if sensing the importance of the moment. "Looks like we've got another mission, buddy," Davis said, giving Scout a pat on the head. The dog barked, his tail wagging, ready for whatever lay ahead. Reynolds nodded, his eyes softening just a fraction as he looked at Scout. "We're putting a lot of trust in you three. Don't let us down." With that, Reynolds turned and left the room, leaving Davis, Carter, and Scout alone with the file. Carter let out a long breath, shaking his head. "Just when I thought we could catch a break," he muttered, though there was a hint of a smile on his face. Davis smiled, closing the file and standing up. "You know, Carter, I think we're getting pretty good at this. And with Scout leading the way, I'd say we've got a good shot at taking them down." Carter nodded, grabbing his jacket. "Yeah, I guess you're right. Besides, it's not like we can let these guys slip away after everything we've been through." Scout barked again, still trotting as he moved over to Davis, his eyes shining bright with determination. Davis smiled, ruffling the dog's ears. "All right, Scout. Let's go finish what we started." The three of them exited the office, the now familiar sense of purpose settling over them as they made their way through the bullpen. Their colleagues gave them encouraging nods, and a few even gave Scout pats on the head as they passed. The little dog had become a symbol of hope and determination, and everyone believed in him. The drive to the location in the file took them deep into the city, to an area that had seen better days. The buildings were old and run down, the streets littered with debris. Davis pulled the SUV to a stop a few blocks away from their target, a seemingly abandoned building with boarded-up windows and graffiti covering the walls. Carter peered through the binoculars, his eyes scanning the area. "Looks quiet." "Too quiet," he said in a low tone. Davis nodded, his eyes narrowing. "That's what bothers me. Let's move in carefully." We don't know what we're dealing with yet. They stepped out of the SUV, Scout jumping down beside them, his ears perked, his nose already working to pick up any scents. The three of them moved quietly, sticking to the shadows as they approached the building. Davis could feel his heart pounding, the familiar adrenaline of a mission coursing through his veins. They reached the side of the building, Carter peering through a crack in one of the boarded-up windows. "Looks like there's movement inside," he whispered. "A few guys, armed." Davis nodded and signaled for Carter to move towards the back entrance while he and Scout took the front. Simple concept: catch them off guard and lessen the chances of any getting away. Scout stuck close to Davis, muscles tensed, eyes focused ahead on the door. With a deep breath, Davis pushed the door open. The old hinges let out a loud groan in the silence. He stepped inside, his weapon drawn. Scout was right beside him. The interior was dimly lit, and the air was thick with dust. Davis could hear voices, he presumed from a room down the hall, and he moved cautiously, trying to make his footsteps noiseless upon the worn floorboards. As they approached the room, Scout gave a low growl, his eyes locked on the door. Davis nodded, understanding the signal. He reached for the doorknob, turning it slowly before pushing the door open. Inside, three men were gathered around the table, their heads snapping up in surprise as the door swung open. "FBI! Don't move!" Davis shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. The men hesitated for a split second before one of them reached for his weapon. But before Davis could react, Scout lunged forward, his teeth bared as he grabbed hold of the man's pant leg, pulling him off balance. The man fell to the ground with a grunt, his weapon skidding across the floor. Just then, Carter burst through the back door with his weapon trained on the remaining two. "Hands where I can see them!" he hollered loud and clear. Both men raised their hands as the realization of being surrounded etched into pale faces. Davis quickly moved in, securing the man Scout had taken down before cuffing the others with Carter's help. Scout stood by, his chest out, his tail wagging as if he knew had just saved the day once again. "Good job, Scout," Carter said, giving the dog a pat on the head. "You're a real hero, you know that?" Scout let out a happy bark, his eyes were bright with excitement. Davis couldn't help but smile as he looked at the little dog. "You really are something else, Scout," he said, his voice filled with admiration. With the suspects secured and the building cleared, Davis radioed for backup, his heart finally beginning to slow. They had done it, again. They had stopped the remnants of the smuggling ring before they could regroup, and it was all thanks to Scout. They walked the suspects out of the building, into the setting sun, its golden rays casting over the city. Davis looked down at Scout, proudly trotting by his side, his head held high. "You know, Scout," Davis said in a soft voice, "I think you were meant for this. You're not just a street dog anymore. You're a hero." Scout looked up at Davis, his tail wagging, and Davis knew whatever lay in store, they would face it together. They were a team, Davis, Carter, and Scout. There was nothing they couldn't handle. As they hopped back in the SUV, ready to head back to the field office, Carter turned towards Davis and gave a grin. "Think we will ever get a mission that won't involve this little guy?" Davis started laughing and shook his head. "I sure hope not. I don't think I'd want to do this without him." Carter nodded in agreement. "Yeah, me either." With that, they drove off into the evening, the city lights twinkling in the distance. Scout lay in the back seat, his eyes closing as he settled in for the ride. He was tired, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that came from knowing you'd done something important, something that mattered. As Davis and Carter exchanged a look, the two of them smiling, the one thing that they knew for sure was this: anything was possible with Scout at their side. Together, they were unstoppable. This was only the beginning of their adventures.